So we're going to start with how to make our binding. Now I'm using a slightly smaller square of fabric here because that's the only way I can get it into the shot. The size of the fabric is in the pattern, so what you need is a square, and the size of the fabric is in the pattern. Now this is a simple cheap cotton fabric from an Aldi fat quarter. So I've cut my square, and as I say, the size of the square will be in the pattern, so you can use that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a cut that goes from this top corner to this bottom corner. So I'm going to use my quilting ruler to cut my square into 2 triangles. I'm going to take my second triangle and I'm going to lay it over the top of the first triangle, right sides together. So what I end up with is this strange sort of almost like a square with a triangle cut out. Now I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to stitch down this side using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to go and do that and I'll come back to you once I've done it. So I've now stitched all the way down this side using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now if I open this up, you can see we end up with a sort of a parallelogram. So I'm going to turn it over so that it's wrong side up. And I'm going to take my iron and I'm just going to open up that seam allowance and I'm going to press it open. Now for this project, our binding needs to be cut on the bias because we're going around curves. And if we want to go around curves and make fabric manipulate around the curves, we need it to be cut on the bias because it gives our fabric much more flexibility. So I've opened up that seam. I can now remove my ironing pad and turn my panel over. And you can see this is why I used a slightly smaller panel, because it gets huge and it goes right out of shot. Now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to straighten off one of the edges because I've got a little tiny bit extra. You can see where I've just stitched it together. There's exactly the same on the other side. It's just that little tiny extra bit that you just don't want. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it around because that way my ruler is orientated the right way. I'm going to turn my ruler around so it's orientated the right way. And I'm going to measure, I'm going to cut strips from this piece of fabric that are 2 1/4 inches wide. I'm going from the long side I appear to probably need a new blade on my rotary cutter because I've got a couple of threads there that just haven't cut. So there's my first strip. Your parallelogram will be bigger than this because you're using a bigger piece of fabric, but this just gives me, this allows me to be able to show you and have it actually on camera. Now you must make sure that you very accurately measure. So having cut my first strip, cutting my second strip, make sure you do this as accurately as you can. Remember, this fabric is an interface, so it will jiggle around a little bit. And just keep going until you've completely used up all the fabric. You'll have more strips than I've got, but you've now got all of these wonderful strips of fabric that are 2 1/4 inches wide. And you can, if I just give that a little pull, you can see it's got a little bit of elasticity to it. Now, if I were to have cut strips, let me just cut a strip from the side of this fabric that's not cut on the bias, and I'll show you the difference. So let's cut a strip that's 2 1/4 inches wide from this. So this is cut on the grain, and it has hardly any stretch to it. There is a tiny bit, but not a lot. And we have to use bias cut fabric. Now, what does bias cut actually mean? When you buy a woven fabric, so this is my piece of woven fabric. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that there are threads going this way and threads going that way. And it's a bit like when you're at school doing weaving, you have under, over, under, over, over, under. I can't make my fingers bend that way, but the warp and the weft threads, so the left and the right threads and the up and the down threads, go under and over each other, which is what forms your fabric. We'll have all done that with paper and bits and pieces when we were at school. And what we're actually wanting to do is to cut our fabric at 45 degrees, because that gives it stretch. When you pull it this way, no stretch. When you pull it this way, lots of stretch, and that gives it flexibility. Now, if you were binding something that had straight edges, you could make your binding cutting it on the grain at 90 degrees to your warp or weft threads, and it would be absolutely fine. But if you want to go round a curve, you have to have that flexibility. So we've created our strips, and you'll have more strips than me because you'll be using a bigger square. I'm now going to take them to the machine and show you how we join those together. So here we are at the machine. I have my strips. I've got 2 ends of my strips. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put them right sides together so that the short ends overlap slightly. You can see there's a corner there that's overlapping off of the side, and a corner on this side that's overlapping slightly. And you need approximately 1/4 inch on either side overlapping. And what will happen, what we're going to do, quite difficult to do to show you, is we're going to stitch from the point where that little triangle notch is across to the same point on the other side. Easier to show you once it's actually stitched, I think. So I'm just going to lay those two together so they're right sides together. I've got a brightly coloured thread in here, so I hope that will allow me to show you. It's quite difficult to hold up because it's not interfaced, so the fabric is a bit on the stretchy side. So if I show you now, if I can hold it up, you can see that I've stitched from that sort of indent on that side to the same point on the other side. So it's that little tiny triangle at the top there. So I've overlapped them. And then I can open them up, and I have a beautiful horizontal, angled rather, mitered join. So I'm going to take the next strip, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing again. I'm going to lay them right sides together with the little tiny triangles at the corners just slightly offset. And then I'm going to stitch together between the 2 little triangle indents. And there we go. So that's, there you go, you can see it better this time. So I'm just going to grab my ironing board. My scissors and the iron. You're going to join all of your strips together. And once you've joined them all together, you're just going to turn it over so that it's wrong sides down. And when we get to these joins that we've just made, let's just move that camera slightly. We're going to open up those seams. And in the same way as we did before, we're going to press them open. And you'll have little tiny sort of triangle bits on either side. You can trim those off because you don't need them. You can carry on along your binding until you get to the next one. What you need to try and do when you're making this is not to stretch it as you're doing it, because you want the stretch. You'll need the stretch to be able to go round the curves smoothly. So pressing it open, removing the little extra bits on the side because you don't need those, and continuing on until you get to the end of your binding. Now you will have a lot more than I've got, it has to be said. Once you've completed all of that, we are very simply going to fold our binding in half along the long side and press it. And it's worth doing this really carefully so that those raw edges match perfectly. There's something really therapeutic about doing this. What you must be careful of is you don't pull it as you're doing it. Don't be yanking it because you'll literally press out all the stretch from it. So do it nice and gently. It's a lot easier on a big table, on a big ironing board, than it is on a small table, on a little pressing mat. But I don't have a camera stand above my ironing board. I probably could do this easier if I did it that way, actually. So we're folding it in half and just pressing it. That's better. And we're pressing it wrong sides together. Now, this is quite a small print. It's a sort of a flowery type thing, fairly nondescript. And for binding, I think it's always better to use something that's either a small print or just a gentle, just a simple pattern, not something that's got a big print on it. I personally much prefer plain binding, because I think in this instance, binding is actually a feature of the crap caddies. So I quite like them in plain, and it means that I can coordinate my binding with both the inside and the outside fabric. But it's your choice. If you plan on using a stripe or a check for this, be warned, it can make your eyes go really funny. And you won't, you'll be getting a headache and migraines because it just makes your eyes go peculiarly. So there we go, we have our binding completed. Now, I think on the next video, for some reason, I tell you that the binding is 1 inch wide, and it isn't 1 inch wide. It's 1 inch and 1/8 wide. So I take my binding and I generally just roll it up so that I know it's going to stay nice and folded. Until I need to use it. Now this is exactly the same technique as I use if I'm doing piping on a bag. I'll use bias cut fabric to make piping. It's a really good habit to be able to do. It's a really good skill to have. If you're a dressmaker and you use bias binding in sleeves or anywhere inside of it, or even for sort of Hong Kong seams inside of a garment, then you can cut your bias binding in exactly the same way, rather than buying shop bought binding, you fold the two sides into the centre as opposed to folding in half like we have now, but that will give you bias binding. Obviously the binding needs to be cut to the width. If you're making inch bias binding, then you would need to cut accordingly. Our binding for our crap caddies is 1 1/8 of an inch. Even though I believe on the next video I will say an inch, because I'm actually doing this video after I've done the other one. So that's how we make our binding. Easy really, wasn't it? Wasn't too difficult. Obviously your square will be bigger to start with, but I used a smaller square so that I could fit it in the camera shot. But that's how you do it. That's how you make binding.